Hey, what's up, you guys? It's Brittany, and welcome back to the American Social Welfare series. This episode, we will be engaging in ethical reasoning using first ethical principles, an outcomes or utilitarian approach, a relativist approach, as well as practical considerations so that we can determine what is right and what is wrong. In case you haven't heard of those long technical terms that I just used, let's go ahead and start by defining them. When confronting specific policies, social workers must answer the elemental question, what is wrong and what is right? In order to reach moral conclusions, we must answer this question by engaging in ethical reasoning. We commonly engage in ethical reasoning in three ways.
Let's get ethical. I wanna get ethical.
When using the first of our three approaches to ethical reasoning, we examine the relative ethical merit of a specific policy or the absence of a policy with respect to outcomes. This is known as an outcomes approach, often called utilitarian ethics. When evaluating the ethical merit of a specific social policy, for example, we ask if it improves the well-being of its beneficiaries, not only improves the well-being of its beneficiaries, but does so at a reasonable cost and provides other benefits to the nation. While it is very useful to examine the outcomes of policies to determine their ethical merits, this approach has its flaws. To make up for these flaws, we must engage in first ethical principles in an approach to ethical reasoning called deontology. Deontologists contend that ethical principles should hold precedence over outcomes, even when the latter are successful. These ethical principles are derived from precepts in major religion and philosophical beliefs that are necessary for a functioning society. First-order ethical principles include honesty, freedom, self-determination, confidentiality, the right to stay alive, due process, fairness, and social justice. When ethical principles conflict with one another, we find it difficult to make ethical choices. Some philosophers criticize both utilitarians and deontologists, arguing that most people make ethical choices not through an extended process of ethical reasoning, but by resorting to norms derived from their particular culture. These philosophers are often called relativists, who emphasize how culture in specific historical eras powerfully shapes perceptions of what is right and what is wrong. Relativism lacks any first-order principles and any consideration of outcomes. In this approach, ethical choices would not have parameters. Our choices may also be shaped by practical considerations such as the availability of resources or political calculations. However, when making moral judgments about social policies, we cannot focus excessively on practical considerations because we risk becoming opportunists with no moral foundation. While examining ethical issues in contemporary society, we should ask a variety of questions that reflect all of the philosophical approaches that we have discussed thus far. This requires us to integrate or synthesize information during a process of reasoning. In this process, we look for points of convergence and divergence. If two perspectives converge to suggest that a specific policy or action is more estimable than others, we can be fairly certain about our resulting decision. If these considerations lead us in diverging paths, we have to devote time and thought to seeking some resolution. Despite the ultimate choice, we engage in a process of ethical analysis as we use a variety of considerations to decide whether a policy is virtuous. A topic I would like to analyze is sex education in public schools. Until the 1960s and 1970s, the goals of social hygiene and moral purity activists eclipsed broader sexual health concerns in the public health arena. Their narrow goals were to prevent sexually transmitted infections, stamp out masturbation and prostitution, and limit sexual expression to marriage. From the 1960s on, support for sex education in schools began to gain widespread support. However, beginning in the 1980s, a debate began in the United States between a more comprehensive approach to sex education, which provided information about sexual health, including information about contraception, and abstinence-only programs. Education about sex and sexuality in U.S. schools progressed in these two divergent directions. Evidence to support the utilitarian approach includes a study done by Douglas Kirby in November 2007, where he concluded that programs that stress abstinence, as well as the use of protection by those who are sexually active, do not send mixed messages. They have, in fact, a positive impact on young people's sexual behavior, such as delaying initiation of sex and increasing condom and contraceptive use. This strong evidence suggested that some comprehensive sex education programs should be widely replicated. In another study, Kirby also found that all the rigorously evaluated abstinence-only programs were ineffective. No program helped raise the age of first intercourse. No program helped teens postpone having sex. No program helped sexually active teens become sexually abstinent. No program helped reduce the number of teen sex partners, and no program helped improve the use of condoms or other contraceptives among sexually active teens. From a deontologist's approach, comprehensive and medically accurate sexual education could be seen as some individuals as violating their freedom. At the same time, abstinence-only education programs violate the right to correct and accurate information. When we have two ethical principles that collide, we must find a compromise. Evidence to support the relativist approach includes 3 decades of national polling showing that the vast majority of Americans, especially American parents, have long supported comprehensive, medically accurate sexuality education. Only 36% of Americans have supported abstinence-only education programs. I think it's important to consider the progress that was made regarding sex education in public schools. In 1981, Congress passed the Adolescent Family Life Act, AFLA, also known as the Chastity Law. It funded educational programs to promote self-discipline and other prudent approaches to adolescent sex or chastity education. Federal funds were developed by churches and religious conservatives nationwide. 12 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court held that federally funded programs must delete direct references to a religion. Such programs could no longer, for example, suggest that students take Christ on a date as a chaperone, which is a clear violation of the principle of separation of church and state. Finally, as we engage in ethical reasoning, it is clear that all 3 approaches converge to suggest that comprehensive sexual education is more meritorious than abstinence-only education. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has identified 44 evidence-based curricula that are effective at preventing teen pregnancies, reducing sexually transmitted infections, or reducing rates of associated sexual risk behaviors, such as sexual activity and number of partners, as well as increasing contraceptive use. Unfortunately, despite widespread public support, particularly from parents, only 20 states mandate sex education and HIV education. Only 19 states mandate the provision of information about birth control. Only 9 states mandate inclusive instruction about sexual orientation. And only 13 states mandate that instruction in sex education and HIV education be medically accurate. In conclusion, we must recognize the progress that has been made to educate the youth about sexual education. However, there are still major reforms that can be made to better provide accurate information about sex, sexuality, and sexual health to both young people and adults.